So welcome back to the studio, and as you can see, we've got a really packed painting for you to do this week. In fact, it was so packed, well, it actually overflowed into next week, but that's okay. There's a ton of information in the video this week. Lots of lovely Bob Ross techniques, like corner the brush, and lovely underpaintings as well. So make sure you watch the video right to the very end, because there's a little snippet right at the very last bit about what's coming up next week. So get those brushes out and let's get painting. So here's my little bit of paper I'm going to be doing some planning on. I'll bring up the reference picture next door so you can see it together. Now, the very first thing that's likely to happen when you look at something like a reference photograph with lots of trees and bushes and foliage, and wow, it's a little overwhelming, isn't it? And there's always a good chance that we can end up sort of really almost talking ourselves out of it. So my first step is always to break it down into some simple shapes. Ignore everything else, but try and get some basic shapes in position. On my little bit of paper, I'm going to simply use a pencil. And the first thing I want to try and do is set out the position of this road. It leaves the canvas over here on the left, not quite at the bottom, but a little bit above. And it leaves just a little bit further than the centre to the right. So that's the exit point for this road. Now, the next question I ask is, how far up the canvas does it leave into the distance? Well, it's well below halfway. It's probably closer to a third. So if I drew a line about a third way down my paper, and the exit point is quite close to centre. Now we can see that we could draw a nice little sweeping curve into the distance, and this is fairly straight until it gets to the very end. We'll get that a little bend back. Now don't worry if there's any little redrawings needed here. This is just the sketch to get down the basics. So now we have our road. Now we have that in position, we can think about putting other things around it, like this little raised area of ground just to the side of the road. It's sort of like a little hump. We know that everything on this side is on a bit of a slope, and that also comes round. So this is sort of a bit of a hump, and this is all a little bit of a slope. So once again, we can quickly identify the positions of things, and now we've got room to put all the other details in. We know on top of this nice hump here, there's some lovely trees. Now that hump isn't go quite that high up, does it? It's a little bit lower than that. So let's change that to about there. Let's drop in a tree. There we go. My little friend. I've got lots of friends with him today. And these will go off in the distance. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff happening back in there I'm not even going to think about. All I need to know is where this road is, and these two elements of my painting. Upon that, I can paint the rest of it. So you see, I broke this entire painting down into just 2 or 3 really basic sorts of shapes. Once you get those on your canvas, well, I reckon the rest of the painting will paint itself. Famous last words. So let's get this onto the canvas. So here's my canvas, 16 by 20 landscape, which means lengthways, and as usual, it's painted with grey gesso. It's got a little bit of texture on it. We might play with something else to make sure this texture really is good, because I think sometimes we paint on canvases which are a little bit too smooth. It's sometimes hard to get a nice bit of sort of detail in here from the canvas, but we'll look at that later on in the video. Now, here's our little sketch, and if you remember, what we did is we came across here, we sent out a little mark, not quite to the bottom, a little bit further than halfway here, and we wanted to be having our road disappearing about a third way up the canvas, so somewhere back in here, it's about a third the canvas, and it was just a little bit to the right of centre. So here's our one exit point, and here's the other exit point. It's where our road just bends away. I'm just going to curve it round. Again, kind of curves back on itself, doesn't it? Again, I'm not too worried about these angles if they're not quite right. One thing I do know is that as things tend to go away from us, these angles need to be a little steeper, a little sharper. It's no good having big sort of open shapes like that, because they don't look like they're receding, but things in the distance need to have a little bit more of a sharp edge to them. Okay, so that sharpness there tells me that it's bending around and then snapping back and off into the distance, back in here. And this is just a nice soft curve. And again, I look at my little reference picture. I made a little bit of a curve there. Again, I think that needs to just change direction at the very end there. So that's our vanishing point, right back in the distance there. I have my reference photograph to quick double check against. Just looking at the angles and make sure I've got everything roughly in the right sort of position. I'll do a little bit more work to this and tidy it up a little bit more, but no real added difficulty to this picture at this stage. You just want to keep simple blocks. Okay, in that last little sequence you saw me just firming up the position of a couple of trees, darkening up a couple of trees and just reshaping this hill a little bit. This was just a little too big. I just reshaped it. And I did what I always advise you to do, is once you've done a little bit of your painting, stand back, get way back from it and have a good look at things. And things have moved around on my painting a little bit. I think in the reference photograph, this is probably right of center. And on mine, I've moved it left of center. I've kind of compressed my painting a little bit. I've kind of zoomed in on it a little bit more. The original photograph was actually wide. I'd need a really big canvas over about here probably to squeeze it in on the same scale. So I've compressed everything a little bit in. And that moved my vanishing point here left of center. And I'm okay with that. I'm still well on my third mark. That's about a third. That's about a third. So I'm really on quite a nice plane there. This big clump of trees falls on another third. It's a classic sort of dividing your painting up into thirds. But one thing I do want you to have a look at here, and that is relative positions, because this tree is further away than this tree. This is much closer. And yet if you look at where their feet are on the canvas, why doesn't this tree look like it's in the same place as this tree? In other words, why doesn't this tree look further forward and this tree look further back? Well, the obvious thing is scale. That tree doesn't look near as big, so it must be further away. This tree, bigger, stronger looking, it must be closer. And yet, they're actually standing almost in line with each other. The other thing is colour. This was going to be a really strong dark tree, so it's going to look like it's really coming forward in the picture, so it'll be standing closer to where we are standing in the road viewing the scene. This is going to be more obscure, and this is the whole idea with this painting. It's to gain depth and distance by slowly making the colours off in the background less and less intense. In fact, these trees in the background here, they're really in the murky bits, aren't they? Really kind of almost barely see them. They're back in the fog. In fact, nothing really comes into really sharp focus until you get to this tree and this tree, maybe that tree, but everything else behind it is sort of in the fog. This is how we use a lighting effect to gain depth and distance in our painting. So I think it's time, I'm happy with this now, to start actually putting some of this on the canvas with some paint. And again, I know a lot of you are going to cheer because I'm going to be doing a lot of this in acrylic as an underpainting. Purely for time. If I had all the time in the world, I could do it all in oils and then leave it to dry for a couple of weeks, but I need to get on with this painting for you. So let's break out some acrylic paint. The first one I'm going to do is get some of these nice blacks and whites and greys. I think get some tone going in here, get some contrast. To get my underpainting started, I'm going to be using some black and white acrylic, and I'm going to add a little bit of brown to it. Some of this, and this is some burnt sienna, but this is just the first brown colour I picked up. You could use almost any brown really, because we're just really tinting the colours. For brushes, I like to use a nice mixture, probably mainly synthetic brushes. If I'm using anything water-based like acrylics, I prefer to use an acrylic brush or a synthetic brush, but I do have some very, very old and worn bristle brushes. Again, don't mind washing these in soap and water, but I like to keep my oil painting brushes purely for working with oils. I can wash them in some odourless thinners, so these are my choice for the underpainting. Paint set out on my plastic plate as usual. Now let's bring up that reference photograph in the corner there. I've got mine just down there out of shot, and the tree trunks I'm looking at here in the background, very, very grey, can barely see them. Don't mind if they're going to be a bit darker on my painting, because I'm actually going to be putting some titanium white and blue mixture over this, maybe even a lavender mixture. So if these are a little bit dark, I don't mind too much. I can make them fade and disappear. So I'm going to start off with some titanium white, little touch of black. Remember, take your darkest colour to your lightest colour. Don't try and take light into dark. So you'll use a whole bottle of white just trying to tone that down. So there we go. So it's a colour that's a little bit darker than what we have here in the background. And all I'm really looking for here is just to get the basic shapes in. As I say, they're very, 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 very pale back in there. There's no real detail. I might drop in a couple of more trees back in there. I don't know if there really are trees back there, but see, by just dropping in the suggestion of a couple of trees. As I say, I'm going to vary my colours a little bit from just a little darker than the background to colours that are obviously very dark. And as I start working forward and start building up my trees, so I'll start using just a tiny bit more black, even take a little touch of that sienna colour into it, so it starts to get a little bit almost purpley looking, doesn't it? And that's more for these trees here. They're going to be stronger. Wash my brush out. You can see I'm mixing up some brown and white, touch of black. I want a sort of smoky brown colour here. Just using a round brush for this, and these are for these sort of trees that are in the background here. So I'm not sure, if they need to be this dark. They probably don't be. I just take a little bit more white into that mixture and calm them down a little bit more. You look like they're standing behind the hill. So I'm just going to drop these in. Keep the shape nice and simple. Drop a couple of these in. There's this nice one here on the hump. That looks pretty good. That's it. Just going to drop that one in. And for those really fine branches, I'm going to go for this. Again, just a synthetic liner brush. I think this one's called a golden tacklon. These instantly hold, really do have their shape lovely. Make sure you put in plenty of little sticks and twigs in this area here. Further back you won't see very much, but I'm going to add a whole bunch of them. And for this I'm probably going to use a little bit of time lapse. Again, I'm only using various mixtures of the brown, white and black. Again, I've got an old filbert brush, a little bit of black and white. A little bit of brown in there, and again, I just want to sort of shape this up in here. Don't care if this is sort of really not totally accurate. I should come back and do something more with this. Just trying to get the tracks. So like, obviously there's a fair bit of traffic through here, so just want to try and get that sort of sense of distance here, going off into the distance. I underpaint this with a little bit of this brown colour, and I picked burnt sienna for this because it's got a really nice sort of nutty orangey brown colour to it. Kind of suits this sort of woodland type scene that we're working with, so it wasn't a mistake. I didn't pick so much at random, but you know, you pick whatever colour you have, pick a paint, mix it up, make it the right colour for your painting is the answer, really. I'm just going to use this up. I'm going to literally fill this out with this lovely orangey colour, and then we can have ourselves a nice cup of tea and let this dry. And whilst it dries, we can think about the next stage, which is, I think I want to put in some foliage on here. But I want to have another look at that reference photograph. So I'm going to bring it up big and I'm going to fill the whole screen with it. What I want you to do now is to look beyond the obvious, which is all the beautiful overhanging foliage, the lovely oranges and the reds, everything, basically everything in the foreground, that's right in front of you. And I want you to start looking towards the background. In other words, behind all of that lovely, bright, flashy, wonderful foliage which you're going to do in oils, but look behind those trees, look to the distance, look into the background and tell me what you see. Because way off down the other end of that drive, that road, you can see there's really just a mass of sort of different shades of light and dark. Very, very shady, very, very sort of difficult to make anything out particularly. Little touches of light here and there, very definite purple cast. And over to the left behind the trees just on that bank, you can see there's some more trees back in there. But look at the colour, dull green, nothing vibrant. And if we look over on the right hand side behind those big trees, you can see there's more of that same sort of dull lavender colour here. So everything in the background has got low colour. In other words, it doesn't have a great deal of contrast. It's sort of middling greys, middling green colours, but nothing really bright, nothing really sharp that gets your eye. And that tells us that it must be further away. Low contrast and low detail tell us that it's behind the trees that are closer to us in the foreground. And I want to try and reproduce that effect on my painting. So as I said, my painting's dry. I'll bring the reference photograph up in the corner. And if you've seen any of my videos before, you know that one of my favourite tools for doing backgrounds is one of these. And it's a piece of car sponge. And they usually come looking like that. And what I do is I just hack them up, and then I sort of use a pair of pliers, or I just use my fingers, and I literally just tear little bits of foam rubber off them until I get something that looks like that, the surface of the moon. Then I can go into some acrylic paint and I can stipple on, I can create lovely patterns back there without having to work at it too hard. These colours in the background I'm going to mute further still when we do the oil paints, but for the time being I just want a sort of greyish tone back in there. So I'm going to carry on using my little plate, my piece of sponge, and this time a lot more white, just tapping it out of my palette and getting a nice colour there. Remember, most of this back in here we're going to kind of even soften down a little further, and I like to use my sponges to hold it on a corner so I can just tap gently with it. Now you're going to lose some of your tree branches, that's okay, we can put those back in if we need to. But the idea here is just to create a lovely greyness back there in the distance. There we go, that's a little maybe a little on the dark side. Again, back into your plate, adjusting your colours all the time. There we go. I'm just going to try and show you this without getting my hand in the way. And I'm going try and put some of these little bits of texture here in the background too. Once again, I can repair all of this when I do the oils. So here's my canvas, about 15-20 minutes later, and I think my colour's darkened slightly. Not a tremendous amount, because there was actually quite a lot of white in there already. But I want to make sure this is dry before I try painting the next colour on here. Now, let's have a look at our little reference photograph. What I'm looking at here is the colours in the background. And you can see I've already had a little dabble here to mix up some nice green colours here. So not the bright, zippy sort of really splash of bright green here. It's the colours behind these trees that I want to do next. There's a little bit of nice green down here, but this lovely bank of green behind this bright green tree. These colours I'm going to do in oils. So it's these dull colours in the background. See, I've got that lovely sort of purpley colour in through there. This nice orangey colours back in here. There's even some sort of mustard yellow colours. I think I'm going to try and get those done in acrylics as well. So let's have a look and see what's on my plate. I cleared a little bit of a space. I had a little bit of a play with a few colours whilst that paint was drying. And I think what I'm looking for here is just cadmium yellow, a little bit of hooker's green. Now this might be a little bit too vibrant. What do you think? Well, let's put some on our painting. The yellow and black, for instance, gave me an olive green colour. This now gives me a colour which is, again, isn't too bad, but it's still not quite the right tone. Is that I'm missing another ingredient. What do you think that colour could be? I have a clue. I think it might be a blue colour. Well, I hunted through my box of acrylic paints. I came across this ultramarine blue. It's a Susan Shibi colour. My goodness, this is an old tube of paint. Ultramarine blue, that'll do the job. So, there's a little bit of it left in the tube, because that colour I know is sort of an alpine green colour. And you see, as soon as I hit that with a little touch of blue, I get that nice sort of alpine green colour. I think that's pretty much on the money on our reference painting. So that's the sort of colour I'm trying to match back in there. And I'll put a little bit of that out. Yeah, that's not a million miles away from the colours I'm looking for. If I add a little touch of white over the top of that, I reckon I could be on the money. And as you might have guessed, I'm going to use a filbert brush to do this just for fun. So there we go, there's our alpine green colour. A bit of blue-green. And as I say, I'm just going to stipple this on here in the background, and you decide how much of this you want to add into there. If I paint over a tree, I can certainly put it back. It won't take me a minute to do it. Right, and for this, I'm going to do a little bit of time lapse, of course. Well, after about 10 or 15 minutes of stippling away here, I've got quite a nice sort of range of colours on here. Now, I appreciate this doesn't look very distant now. This has all come far too far forwards, but it's okay, because I'm going to be using some oil paint over this section to push it back. I'm going to be using that same technique all the way through here and into the background. So right now this looks a little bit close, but I promise you it won't look like that in a minute when I get the oils going. Now, the other colour I want to try and get into here, there's a nice sort of mustardy yellow colour coming through, particularly under these trees up here. I put a little bit of green in here, and you know me, I try not to introduce a new colour unless I really have to. I prefer to try and mix a colour. So what I've got is some of the original cadmium yellow colour I used, and some of the original brown colour. When I mix those two together, because this is a sienna type colour, tends to make these lovely mustard tones. So I've got the colour I need for my background foliage. Let's try a little dab of it. I reckon that's going to work out pretty darn good. This might be a bit slow though. I think I might have to go back to using a piece of sponge, and I've got a nice fresh bit here to try. But as you can see, it doesn't take long before I can start to really get some good colour going on my painting. Now, I think a little bit more time lapse, and I'll just paint this area in, and then I'll leave the whole thing to dry probably overnight, and then tomorrow we can come back and we can start working again in oils. So what can I do to my painting to increase the sort of grippiness, or the tooth as it's called? Well, I've got this product. I don't even remember where it came from. It just turned up in my paint box of supplies. And it's a clear gesso, and it includes the words adds tooth, which is the grip or the texture of the canvas. So I thought, it's clear, why not put some on my painting? But before I do, I'll do a little test. Here's one of my little colour charts that I used for a seascape recently, and down here is a patch of that particular clear gesso. If I run my finger over this, that comes out on camera fairly smooth. And that's more like sort of sandpaper. Hard to see on camera, but this is definitely rougher than this. So I think I'm going to try putting on some of this clear gesso with extra tooth. Well, I've given the bottle a good shake, and I've poured a small amount into a little dish. And I'm going to use a little foam applicator. It looks like sort of PVA glue. And as you can see, it sort of goes on milky looking. I'll put some back here as well. And we'll just let it dry. Well, that's it. I've used nearly all of it up, and I've slapped on quite a good coating of it down here, and I've even put a little bit on my big trees here, because I know they're going to want lots of lovely texture. Oh, don't leave that one out. And so it looks like it just dries clear, so that's going to work out great. And in about 10 or 15 minutes time, I'll come back and run my hand across it and see what it feels like. So here's my underpainting nice and dry, including that lovely rough texture. Now, I thought I'd mention this once again. I mentioned it in the video, but be careful of proportions. As you see, this is very, very much longer than it is tall, okay, in proportion, whereas on my canvas, well, it's a little bit more sort of square, 16 by 20. This is probably more like sort of 16 by 22 or even 16 by 24. So bear this in mind when you're doing drawings and transferring a layout from a photograph to a canvas, that things can move around, particularly things like vanishing points and how much room you allow for things like the trees at the side. In this instance, it won't make a difference, but be careful if it does, because if you've got buildings you're trying to squeeze in, maybe several buildings and several other objects, they can all appear to be a bit crushed together. You might have to leave one or two out. Just a thought. But now, on with some oils. Before I start adding oil paint to my painting, I want to protect the surface with something like this, Bob Ross Liquid Clear Oil Paint. This was a product made famous by Bob Ross, of course, and the idea is that you're going to paint one wet layer on top of another. The first layer is clear for obvious reasons. We don't want to lose this, but it means that then we can blend and add colours directly to the canvas. I can add one layer on top of another onto another. The basic idea being that a thin paint, like a highlight, bright greens and bright oranges, will stick to a thick dark colour. So we have to think about adding 2 layers of oil paint to make everything stick. But let's get this on first. To make application easier, I have some in a small airtight container that I can pop in the freezer, and that will keep it quite happy in there for a few weeks or even a few months. Because this is going to be quite hard work, I've got a really nice old Bob Ross landscape brush. It's one that's been used well. And I'm going to start off by just applying a thin coat of this on my canvas. Now, because this is clear, you can't see anything. But there is a way of testing it. We'll get to that in just a second. I'm going to start off by just scrubbing this in to the corner of my painting. And then we're going to fetch a torch. I've zoomed into my canvas and I'm using the light on my mobile phone just to show you what I'm doing. Now down here you can see the light of my torch being reflected on this rough surface, but it looks sort of fairly sort of shiny. But it's when you come up against the liquid clear, can you see that surface there is really much oilier, isn't it? There it is, that's dry and that's got the liquid clear on it. And the idea is that we want to be able to apply a very thin, even coat so that when we drag our finger across it, it doesn't leave any kind of a trail. If you put on too much and it leaves a nice big fingerprint running through it, well, you know you've applied too much. So that's the test. We want just enough to make our canvas wet, but not too wet. I'll carry on applying this to the entire surface of the canvas. It's all covered very nicely, very thin even coat, which I'll finish off with some long flat strokes to make sure I got everything covered completely. And once again, I'll use my mobile phone just to test my colours. As you see, a nice thin coating is all it takes. There, now we're ready for some colour. Let's have a look at our palette. For this, I'm using some titanium white, Prussian blue and alizarin crimson, black, Van Dyke, dark sienna, sap, cad yellow, yellow ochre, Indian yellow and some bright red. And my choice of using Prussian blue and alizarin crimson mixed together will give me a nice purple colour, but Prussian blue is a cool blue colour, so it will give me a nice sort of dull purple tone. See, my yellow colours are trying to make a break for it. I better mix these up. About 5 parts of alizarin to 1 part of blue. And as you can see, I haven't put very much out because, well, I don't need much. It's only for all those background little washes that I want to put on, those glazes. So let's mix them up. To mix my paint, I'm going to use a palette knife. I'm going to just take a small amount of the alizarin crimson and an even smaller amount of the Prussian blue colour. I just want to mix these together, and instantly they make a sort of a nice purplish colour of the blue colour, and you see instantly I get lovely purple colour. But Prussian blue makes a sort of a dull purple colour, which is what I'm looking for. If I was to use phthalo blue, that colour would be really vibrant. Put a little bit of white down there. Yeah, that's the sort of colour I'm looking for. There we go. And we can vary the colours a bit as we go. Now, I'll bring the reference photograph up again in the corner. You can see the colours I'm looking for are back in here. There's sort of a soft lavender colour. In here is quite sort of purpley. There's a little bit of bright colour over on the other side. So let's start off, and I'm going to use just a filbert brush for this. I'll introduce the brushes as we go along. So it looks a bit pinkish, doesn't it? Oh well. So I'm not going to worry too much. But this colour here is right up here on the side. Now remember, these colours are quite opaque. In other words, if you put them over the background, you see how it completely obscures things. But watch, if you use your fingers and just gently rub, it produces that lovely sort of misty effect. And if you rubbed a little harder, you can thin the paint down so that you can start to see some of the original painting through it. With the liquid clear on there, well, it means I can blend and move colour on the canvas. And there's a little piece of light over here. It looks almost a little more to the blue side. Let's take a speck of blue. Just a speck. So you can vary your paints and vary your colours. I think that's just up in here somewhere. Behind these trees. Not sure. Once again, take your finger and you can just smudge that into the background. We're putting some trees across there, so just a little bit of grubby white paint, add a little zinger in there, maybe even a little zinger in there as well. There, doesn't take much to make a big impact. I'll put more of a Prussian blue kind of colour in there too. But you say you can play with these colours. You can do this and make these the colours you want them to be. Put a little bit more blue in there, I think. And say, what happens if you get it wrong? Say you put a colour on there that you don't really like. Well, look, baby wipe. Gently wipe off the excess. Don't go scrubbing at it because we want some liquid clear left on there. So let me use my finger just to rub a little bit of the liquid clear from here across, because that will have taken off most of the colour, most of the oil as well. So there we go, put a slightly more bluish tone in there, I think. There we go. Now, just need to do a little bit of a glaze on this part of my painting. I think that's the background finished. I've even got the original brush I put the liquid clear on with, and you can even use that just to pick up some colour, move it around. And this is quite useful because it doesn't actually take away any of the liquid clear. It just kind of thins things out a little. And you can create these amazing effects just by, say, glazing your painting with these colours. See how that kind of pushes that back. And if I was to put a tree on top of that now, that would bring it forward. It would push everything there way back into the distance. You can even use a little touch of green back in there. Let's try a touch of that just for fun. Yeah, white with a little green mixed into it. Yeah, look at that. Maybe that's what I'm looking for. Scrub that off. Okay. It's so adaptable. You can have fun with this and play around with all your colours. And so a little more, a greenish tint. With my fingertips, it's like I'm kind of joined to it somehow. It's kind of weird, but I can feel the paint and I can feel the texture, and I can sort of just kind of work things in, just push my fingers into the painting. It's kind of strange, I know. It's one of those things artists do. Now, top tip here, we're going to be putting in some bright foliage here at the base of this tree, if you look at the reference over there. And I don't want the background there to be too bright. I want to retain some of this lovely dark in here. So don't go putting tons and tons and tons of light in there, because you're going to make life hard for yourself. And this isn't going to show up very well. Okay, now the other thing to remember, of course, is that as you do this, you might be covering up the odd tree trunk here and there. That one's a foreground one, but these ones are in the background. You can just run your finger along them. Or you can get a cotton bud and just get a little cotton bud and just touch it up. But just think about the light coming from that left side. So maybe you want to pull that right side back out of the mist. And if you overdo it, just run your finger across it again, and you can move them around. So there you go. You've got a lot of power. When you pick up a brush, you can move a tree, you can find a tree, you can put it back. I think this is so much fun to play with, just to see what you want to do with your own painting. I might try getting some rays of light through here as well. We'll see how that one works out later on. Now, I've had a good look at the reference photograph actually, and I see a lot of these mustard trees in the background here are actually also back in the mist. I started that there, and I should have carried on with it. But really, most of these trees here are actually misty and murky, and I'm going to just carry on adding little touches of mist and murk into the painting. I'm just going to use my fingers to do this. Whether any of that shows through in the end, I don't know, but I would rather make it misty and murky looking now and then paint over it, and then to try and put that effect in underneath. So add more than you think you need is the answer. I think that's about right. I think, looking at my reference again, that I'd have to paint this green tree in here first. It's clearly behind this lovely orange tree, and then it'll be the orange one, and then I'm going to work out the order of painting some tree trunks in here as well. And then I think probably it's going to be this tree next, and then that will be done after I've done the tree trunk. So that's my rough order. So this is the tree I'm going to work on next. To start that tree off, I need a good strong dark colour. So I'm going to take some sap green, some Van Dyke brown, a little black, and put in the rest of the Prussian blue colour. Because, as Bob would say, a thin paint will stick to a thick paint. And all of these colours here are really thick and dry and pretty sticky. And I know sometimes people will comment, they say, my underpainting feels too dry and too stiff, too sticky, and shouldn't it be oilier and thinner? And I always say, no, you want it as thick and dry as you can, because it's like glue, just it's coloured dark green, and that's the colour I'm looking for, a really, really nice deep dark green colour. Put a little more blue into that. And this is my underpaint colour, so this is the colour that the bright highlights will stick to, so I want this to be dull and dark. Now, I want to have a look at the reference photograph up there and look at that tree that I'm going to paint. And you see I left a little piece of my canvas there without any kind of lightning effect on it at all. You can kind of see the branch of a nice tree hanging back there in the background. And it kind of hangs in, kind of looks like a series of, it looks like a shaggy dog almost, but see how some of those branches, they kind of hang down and they hang out from the centre like little umbrellas. So that's what I need to paint. Now I've got my old Bob Ross 1-inch brush back that I put the liquid clear on with, and I'm going to pull the brush down in one direction. Just pull it down, kind of open the paint up a little bit. I'm going to start at the bottom and I'm going to push up. And you can see as I push up, I create this little ridge of paint right in front of the bristles. And I'm going to be painting on the left corner of my brush. So I'm going to be tapping on this corner. So I want to favour that corner a little more. Push it forward a little further, make a little kind of V. Hope you can see that on the camera. So that my brush is heavily loaded on one corner. The back of my brush has no paint on it, and that's important because these have to stay open and springy. Can you see they spring? This side is well coated with paint. Now think about, again, the shape. You don't come over too far with this. And I'm just going to hold my brush and tip it on a corner so it's not flat. If it were flat, it would make a straight line. By tipping it slightly on a corner, you can create these nice little ends. Now these should show up against the misty, murky background we just put on. And I want to think about not going too high with this. So I've got the orange tree coming in just above. That's the reason why I put a little bit of orange there. It was to remind me to stop. And as you tap, just think about angling your brush down. You get these nice kind of umbrella shapes. Let me do another one for you. So start tapping there, and then see how I tip the brush. I kind of let it roll over, and then see how I get the little sort of fuzzy ends on there. Back into that little ridge. See again, no paint on that side of the brush. It's all on just one side. And I think that's important because a lot of people get paint both sides of the brush. And what happens, the brush just clogs. It completely clogs and you can't do anything with it at all. It stops giving up the paint in a nice sort of fashion. I left a little piece of orange through here. I'm going to put a little bit of green in under here. Yeah, see again. I was thinking ahead a little bit. I like all those little broken ends on there. Don't try and smooth those down. What it needs now is a little bit of a tree trunk back in here, just to kind of hold this all together. And I'm going to use a little bit of black and brown mixed together and drop in just a few branches in here. For those branches, I want to use a Bob Ross liner brush. And this is dry, and as I remind people, dip them in a little bit of something like linseed oil beforehand. Give them a few minutes just to sit on your palette. Let them absorb a little of the oil and soften up a little bit before you want to use them. I've mentioned this a few times recently because I know people have been having issues with liner brushes not wanting to work so well. And if you can soften them up just for a minute or two, you'll find that they work a lot nicer than if you just use them straight out of the box, all sort of dry and like a straw. I'm going to go into a little bit of Van Dyke brown, a little bit of black. I'm just going to brush mix these together. I want to just add a few branches in here just to kind of hold this all together. See, just up into here. And that's all we're looking for, just the suggestion of a branch or two, just to kind of pull this all together. And they may be joined to maybe that tree there. Let's make him a little stronger. Okay, so you're just looking to put in the suggestion, and some of this might get covered up. When you put the highlights across, you may lose it. So really these are just little suggestions. Let's hit this with some highlights. For my highlights, I want a nice fresh brush. And this one is a pretty nice new brush, actually, nice long soft bristles, and that's really important because you want them to be quite new and really soft and gentle. The brush I was using to do the underpainting with, well, that's a pretty worn out brush. It's great for doing this kind of work, but for this you need something really quite soft. And I put a little bit of sap green into my cad yellow, and look at that colour. Isn't that almost like a fluorescent green colour, isn't it? Smashing. Now, I kept my dark green over here that was here. I moved it across. So if this is too bright, you can dull it slightly, but I think I'm going to go with this really brilliant, vibrant colour. Notice once again, I'm pulling the paint down in one direction. I can see the little Bob Ross logo on there, so I'm going to be pulling it down so I can see that all the time. It stops me flipping my brush over by mistake. Pull it down, and again, push back, favour that left corner because that's the side I'm going to be highlighting with. Here we go, you can see that corner of my brush is heavily loaded with paint. You see how the bristles hold a nice shape. Now, the light's coming in this direction. Tip the brush on slightly on an angle here and just touch. And think about doing one little umbrella at a time. Now, when you do this, you're going to pick up some of the dark colour. No matter how gentle you are, you might pick up a little. And if you do, you can touch it off on a paper towel. There we go. You can just tip the brush on a corner. Don't tip it all the way over, just partly. And I'm going to carry on adding little branches. And as they go away from the light source, they're going to get darker and darker. See, against the light sky, it doesn't really show up very much. The trick is to stop sooner rather than later. If I go over this again, trying to improve it, trying to fix it, I'll end up damaging and smudging what I've already created here. So once you've got this far with it, don't touch it. Leave it alone. It's looking great. If you do it one more time, you will end up smudging it. You always will. Now, one other place I think there's a little touch of highlight, and that's on this bank here, just on this end. Again, you can tip your brush slightly at an angle and just touch. It kind of creates a nice kind of bright glow. If you want, you can even sneaky back in with your old brush and drop in a shadow or two. There we go. Down behind these trees. There we go. So that way you create the shadow under a tree across the top of that bank. Now that was a bit back to front. Maybe I should have put the shadow colour in first, but it just goes to show things are very adaptable. And when you're doing just small changes to your painting, you can get away with a lot of little fixes. Something like that doesn't work out completely, you can pick up your palette knife, zip it right off and have another go. Because it's oil paint and it's slow drying, you can fix things over and over again. Now, I think it's time we work on some of these lovely orange branches next. Now, before I start working on these big trees here, do I have to paint anything else first? Should I be putting in maybe a tree trunk or two before I start thinking about foliage? Because if you look at the reference picture again, I'll bring it up here in the corner again, maybe over there. You can see that there are tree trunks, then tree branches, and then there's foliage on top, and there are some little wiggly tree branches underneath that, and there's something else in the background. So you see, sometimes the order in which you paint things isn't always very obvious, nor does it always really fall very easily sometimes. But I can certainly bring this tree forward a little bit by just kind of cleaning it off. So I can bring those back from the background without having to paint them again. So there you go, so I can find those. They're easy enough to bring forward. But these ones here, they need some new paint on them because they got kind of buried under some of the other foliage there. So I dry cleaned my filbert brush. I'm going to go into some black and Van Dyke brown. I'm just going to brush mix this. I'm not going to bother knife mixing this. And again, I'm going to just drop in, and reinforce and repaint the tree trunks in here. Now, one thing I am going to do is I'm going to leave a little bit of light through here, so this tree doesn't run into that tree. There should be just a little suggestion of light. Now, I don't have to put on a lot of paint to do this tree, because what I'm doing is I'm actually moving some of the other paint out of the way. So my painting's progressing nicely, and as you see, I started moving into the foreground. Keep in mind the order in which you need to paint things. Look at your reference picture and try and work out which things are behind which. Again, this helps with depth and distance. Putting in a tree trunk before you put on the foliage might be the right thing to do, but the other way around, well, that could be a real potential for some pickles, couldn't it? So I have to work steadily, progressively forwards from the background to the foreground. I think it's time to get this lovely bright orange glow into my painting. Then a tree trunk and then more foliage. Well, I think that's the order it should be painted in. Let's see. If we study the reference photograph, I want to take notice of these lovely bright orange stripes going across my painting. And as you see, they're all angled really from that far left corner and across, and then just go over the top of the tree trunk. But the vast majority of the tree branches I'm going to be painting at this stage are going to be in this area. And it's tempting sometimes to start out by painting them over to the right a little bit too far. And then we just end up with a huge bunch of orange on our painting. Actually have a look. We've got a lot of the tree trunk still showing here. So we have to be mindful. When we're putting on these really brilliant highlights, there's a temptation to go, well, a little mad and throw it everywhere. So just work carefully across your painting and maybe even put out a few little markers, just a few little dabs of orange here and there, as I did with my background colours, and I put on just a few little dots of orange here and there just to keep me on track. So I think that's what we'll do next. We'll plan where we put the orange colours before we put them on our painting. Time to mix up some colour. In the area that I tidied up and moved the green away from, I'm going to mix up my orange colour. And for that, my favourite mixture is Indian yellow and a little bit of bright red. Now my Indian yellow is quite a fresh tube of paint, and my bright red, well, it's getting a bit past it to be honest, and I'm probably on the last knockings of this tube. So I have to make sure this is not too stiff and dry, because we want a thin paint for highlighting. But as you see, just a little tiny drop of brilliant red makes the most fieriest of orange colours. If I want to test it, I'll take a little bit on my palette knife and hold it up against my painting. I think I'm not a million miles away. It's pretty darn bright. Now, there's probably a little more of a little bit of a darker brown colour in there maybe. There's a little bit of a burgundy tone to some of this, especially down in here, that's quite burgundy. I think that's probably a little drop of alizarin crimson in there. But for the time being, I'm going to just stick with that brilliant orange colour. I gave my brushes a nice wash, including the original colour brush I used for the liquid clear and the dark green. Now I'm going to chance it a little bit. And I said that painting highlights needs a dark sticky undercolour. The problem is these orangey colours here, they're very light and fine. And if I put on a dark undercolour, I probably use something like dark sienna, I think it might just overpower my painting. As it happens, the liquid clear is just tacky. It might be sticky enough to actually put the highlights directly onto the painting, something I've done before, so it's worth taking a chance. Now, again, I take my brush through the paint in one direction, put it out flat and give it a little push. And I'm going to be still painting on that left corner as I did before. So make sure when you give your brush a little push, you get a little ridge of paint building up. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to put down just a few little markers to start with. I know there's a branch hanging right over here in the corner. I'll put a few little dabs there. There's another branch that comes right through into here, right up close against the green colour, so we've got to be really careful there. And I think there's another branch that comes through about here. It sort of covers up that middle tree there somewhere, so I'm going to put a little bit of a colour there. So this way I'm sort of plotting and planning where I'm going to be going. There's a little bit of that orangey colour there that goes right up against that green colour there. So you see I've already got sort of a line worked out where I'm going to be going. I'm not going to touch the ones over the tree trunks just yet. I'm going to just try and get these ones in first. Now, reload your brush, give it a little push. And again, think about painting each of those little individual branches one at a time, a little like an umbrella. Tip your brush slightly at an angle and just touch. As you see, the colour comes off really nicely and easily. Reload very frequently, keep your brush nicely loaded with paint. And every dab leaves thousands and thousands of little dots of paint on the tips of your bristles. And I can tell you that the edge of my brush is absolutely standing up with paint. There's literally hundreds of little pinpricks of paint. I've got to be a little careful in here because there's lots of green in here. And green and orange will make me a lovely brown tone. Ask me how I know that. Maybe another little branch there. There's a really bright one coming through. Now, I can add a little touch of white to my colour, just to give it that little extra zing. But be mindful, white is firm and dry, and if this paint is already a little on the stiff side, this could just tip it over the edge. And look at that for a brilliant colour. That's a bit of an eye popper. Now, let's see what that does. Put a few little dabs on there and stand back and have a look. I think that's a little bit too bright. I'll take a little bit more of my Indian yellow colour and calm that down a touch. Whew, that's really bright, isn't it? bear in mind my advice that I give you. No one's ever going to see this hanging on the wall next to your reference photograph. So if you like it, do it. I think it looks like the lights really come through. They're bright. Caught that little branch. There's a little bright area in here. I think we're going to have to put on a little bit of a branch here just to hold this together. Stop these sort of floating in midair. Again, still just painting on a corner of my brush. Just tip it slightly. Taste. So there we go, that's the initial burst of orange colour on my painting. I've used up all the paint I mixed up, so it's time to mix up a fresh batch. I've stood back and looked at my painting and I can't help thinking this tree needs to be a little stronger. It just looks a bit sort of soft and fluffy at the top there. So I've gone back with my filbert brush, a touch of Van Dyke brown, a touch of black. I'm just going to strengthen it up a little bit. There we go. And I think that's going to really help bring my tree forward in the painting. Now I feel I can paint the highlights across the front of it without too many worries. I'll see where the highlights land and then see if there's any gaps in between for putting on maybe, say, little touches of green and lichens. But I don't want to make myself too much of a challenge there to work on. So I'll put the foliage across it next. Now I've mixed up a couple of different sorts of orangey colours here. This is the orange colour there, but I put a little tiny touch of alizarin crimson in there. See, it just makes it slightly sort of more sort of strong, darker orangey kind of colour, more like a blood orange. And I think those are the sort of colours I might be seeing over this tree trunk here. It just set back a little bit further under the tree. Again, just going to put on just a little tiny touch to get an eye for it. I think that's not far away. Colours. I haven't forgotten I've got to do something with this bank here. So again, thinking ahead a little bit. Am I creating a problem? Well, I might be. So I'm going to do a little tiny bit more and then I'm going to stop. I'm going to consider my options over a cup of tea, of course. Okay, so I've sat back and had a good look at it from the other side of the studio with my trusty cup of tea just over there. And I'm really liking the whole look of this. And I'd say I don't mind too much if it doesn't match the reference photograph. So it's just what I like, which is the real thing. Don't ever get kind of bent out of shape that your painting doesn't match a reference photograph. It's what pleases you. It'll make sure your heart skip a beat. Now, before I do any more with this foliage, I really need to address this area down here because my eye keeps looking at this unfinished section and keeps drawing my eye to this pathway and road. So I'm going to dig out a couple of my brushes. Now these are my old brushes I use for doing my acrylic work. They're sort of a 3/4 inch and a 1/2 inch flat brush. And I want to use something a little smaller than the Bob Ross 1-inch brush. I could squeeze it in there, I could. But sometimes it's nice just to have a slightly smaller brush, just kind of sneaky in and do some sort of more delicate touches. So again, I'm going to use the same technique for dabbing on. Paint, I want that kind of nice sort of texture because these are all fallen leaves. And on my palette, I've pulled my colours around a little bit. So this is the colour that forms the basis of the majority of the foliage, and that's Indian yellow with red. For the darker maroony orangey colours that I painted up here, these are kind of really quite dark orange colours. This is Indian yellow with a tiny touch of alizarin crimson, and I mean just a speck. Gets this sort of orange burgundy colour, and I love it. This is straight dark sienna. And this is what's going to be forming the darker parts of my driveway. This sort of area along the side here is going to be some dark sienna. And if I need it, I might add a little tiny drop of yellow ochre, just to kind of throw a little variety at it. But I'm going to be using various mixtures of these colours. And because it's a lot of repetition, the same things you've been seeing me doing in the trees here, I'm going to do this area through here and up this bank with some time lapse. I'll drop a few comments obviously as well in the sort of the time lapse so that you understand what I'm doing when I'm switching colours. But it's this repeated but down here. Okay, let's get on with it. So here you see I've started work on that left hand side, and I want to make sure that this line disappears off into the distance. I chop and change my colours a lot for this section of the painting, which is the reason why I didn't try and film it and tell you exactly what I'm doing in real time. We'd be sitting here for a week. It's also the reason why I'm not using the reference photographs so much at this stage, because I'm doing a lot of this sort of by eye, more by feel really. I know the colours I want to use, and so I'm letting the painting tell me what it needs. I play backwards and forwards between my lights and darks. And yes, I switch back to using my big Bob Ross 1-inch landscape brush. It's just a little bit softer and fluffier. The other thing I appreciate now is adding that little bit of clear gesso with some extra tooth. It really takes the paint so much nicer off my brush than just a flat piece of paper or a flat canvas. Something to keep in mind when I'm doing other paintings. At this stage, I'm really overpainting it, and one could be forgiven for wanting to try and squeeze more in than is really kind of advisable with such a wet painting. But as I say, that grippy surface is really taking the paint well, so I push my luck and I carry on adding detail and layers of light and colour. I start adding leaf details, and again, look at the reference photograph and you can see I'm really getting close to what I think will work. So that's it, folks. I didn't quite get there this week with my painting, but that's okay. It gives me an excuse to come back and see if I can sprinkle a little extra magic on this and a few of my other paintings for next week's tutorial. You might find some inspiration to look back at your own work and think, what extra can I do to it to make it that little bit extra special? Now, in the meantime, if you've enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget, like and subscribe to the channel. You can drop a comment. I love reading what you've got to say about my work and your own work, and I try and respond to as many as I can. If you want to go a little further, you can support the channel and further painting tutorials by leaving $1 or £1 or £2 in my coffee cup. I'll leave a link down below in the description. In the meantime, there's some more lovely videos for you to watch coming right along. Happy painting, people!